But the perfect segue to PA is zips. So PA, in your book, you were attracted, you were drawn to punk, not because of the politics, not because of the haircuts, it was the zips.
Yeah, zips, pockets, clips, pins. I used to hang around a shop in Sunderland where I'm from called Millets that had a big section in there for mountain climbing. And by fuck did I love looking at that. I was only 6 or 7, but geez, they had all these buckles and clips and ropes and phenomenal. I still love that stuff. I absolutely love that stuff. And yeah, aged whatever, 11, 1977, opened up a copy of The Enemy that my sister had, and there's a photograph of the Clash. I'm like, fucking hell, are these mountain climbers? Look at all the covered in zips. And that's when I started digging like, it's the whole scene of people who have pockets and zips. It's fucking brilliant. So I listened to the Clash and I thought, absolute garbage. Couldn't get into the first Clash album at all. And it wasn't just an age thing, because then my sister's friend from up the road loaned her a copy of Nevermind the Bollocks, and I listened to that, and literally my life changed halfway through the intro of the first song. I'd never heard anything that had provoked such emotion in my life. The nearest I'd come to that was seeing Sweet on Top of the Pops in 1972. And just seeing the snotty attitude of these people and the shiny guitars, and I just thought, I don't know what the hell I'm looking at, but this is really cool. And after that, nothing in music at all appealed to me. Literally nothing. It was just a void of faceless Pink Floyds and things like that. And it's when I heard Nevermind the Bollocks at that very, very tender age. I actually think when I listened to, I think it was Holidays in the Sun, when I listened to that one, I found myself shaking at the end of it. I just couldn't believe what I was hearing. And so I hoovered up everything that came along. I couldn't stop reading the magazines, looking for the next band that looked like the Clash but sounded like the Pistols. And the sounds used to have like the national charts, but it also used to have like indie charts, and occasionally it would have, one week they'd have the punk chart, and another week they'd have the metal chart, or whatever, the reggae chart. And I'd go down the punk chart, and I'd look at every single thing there, and I'd try and buy it, and I had no idea what it was. I would try and buy it. So yeah, so that was my introduction to punk rock, really.
Yeah, but it's also your introduction to DIY, because you're one of these people who does a fanzine. So tell us a little bit about Nuclear.
Well, I mean, going back to 77 and 78, by the time that music was hitting us here in Ireland, these were now bands on Polydor and Virgin and EMI and whatever else, and they're basically pop stars. They've been on television, they're selling out stadiums, Cabaret Cinema with the Ramones and whatever else. They're all proper big bands. So as much as I adored listening to them, I couldn't identify with who they were. In the same way as they couldn't identify with Yes, the bands themselves. So they did their own scene. So where I was coming from was I couldn't identify with them personally. I loved what they did, but I couldn't identify with them personally. And one of the things that kept showing up in that NME charts, in the independent charts, was a Crass record. The first Crass rock record that came out. And there it was, sitting at number 1 on Small Wonder, I think, at the time. Sitting at number 1 on the charts, and people were talking about them. And so I started delving a bit more into that. And that's where I got my hands on, I don't know how, to be honest, I ended up with my hands on a fanzine. I went, oh, this is like sounds, but I could write for this. You don't have to be a journalist. So one of the things I'd had another weird obsession with at sort of age 13 or thereabouts was that if you cut loads of things out of newspapers, like Pistols have done, and stick it onto a bit of paper, and go into a shop and photocopy it, it looked fucking great. It looked like a magazine. It looked like something you put on the wall. It was fucking great. So when I saw a fanzine, the first fanzine that I saw, I think it was probably mostly handwritten and stuff like that, and I thought, this is great. So I'm going to have a go at doing this. It wasn't even a, should I do this, or how do I do this, or why should I do this? It was, oh, I'm doing one of these. So from the first fanzine that I actually got my hands on, I noticed, oh, okay, you know, the questionnaire that they sent to, like, the Expelled, or something. Just pick names of bands out there and I posted things over to them. Here's some questions, and they're coming back. Now, unlike most of the fanzines that Niall even alluded to, handwritten stuff and shitty little graphic drawn in the corner, I'm having none of that, right? I'm not having that shit. Luckily, the company that my dad worked for, they had bought a new electric typewriter for the person who did the typing. And it meant that the old one, that was metal, weighed about slightly more than an average car. I said, can I have that? And he brought it home, so I had this typewriter there, and when he pushed the key, it went down about an inch. And I remember the E stuck. And so that was always a challenge, because if you put the E down, which you do, you'd use that a lot. You push the E down, it went E! So out with the tip X or whatever else. So in order to do the E, you had to bang, really jab that in. So, and then it'd be ever so slightly out of sync, and it'd be a slightly darker one than the rest. So, but again, it was a fabulous aesthetic. So I used to type everything for the fanzine, and I do my photocopy, graphic art, designy things. I try and make it look really good. And then, unlike Niall, who went around selling them on the streets, I was too good for that shit. I would put them in Freebird and Basex Records. They'd take 10p out of the 50p or whatever else. I'd put in 10 quid to photocopy 15 copies, get them done, get the money back, go back and do another 15 copies in constant circulation of doing that. Not outlaying any of my own money, because that would be ridiculous because I didn't have it to outlay, and if I did, I'd be spending it on something else. And that's where it kind of came from.
And how many issues did you do?
I think we did about 5 or 6. Deco got involved with me on it on the third one. He said, oh, I'm going to I'm going to give a load of stuff for this as well. Like, all right, fine, yeah. So he put a load of stuff in, but he worked at the time, not destroying his myth or anything, but he worked for P&PA Insurance. He was the person who assessed people's claims. Now, it would be marvellous if your claim landed on Deco's desk, because it was flexi time. And when you finished your day's work, you could go home. So he would get this massive big pile of people's claims. He'd take them down, stamp yes, yes, he'd approve absolutely everything, and then go, 11 o'clock, time to go home. But he then also, some people might have passed comment that, how come Doyle is in here for 3 hours out of an 8-hour day and getting all of his work done? So he used to photocopy the fanzine. And every day he'd spend about an hour and a half in the photocopy room using all the photocopiers, so nobody could come in and see what he was doing. And he'd leave with this big bin liner full of fanzines, go home and staple them, and then we'd bang them out.
Yeah, DIY, there's always a way.
Yeah, there is, yeah.
There's always a way. And your fanzine, it wasn't just music, like there was other stuff. So yeah, what was on your mind when you were putting your zine together? Who were you and who were you communicating to?
I was just communicating to anyone who was interested in listening, which is the story of my life. So a lot of the things that would come in there is that I used to then, you know, write to bands like Crass and Poison Girls and Dirt and Rubella Ballet, and, you know, just write to these guys, and they would send back. And what they were sending back wasn't, here's a review of what our next album's going to be like. You know, it was like, from Crass I got, here's a great way to make brown bread, and a recipe for brown bread. You know, Conflict, they wrote, and they had a free sheet which explained what you should do if you got arrested, or what you shouldn't do if you got arrested. And then Crass had another one which was saying, if you are involved in doing anything which is subversive that you're worried you might get arrested, and change your name. Change your name by deed poll, and every time you change your name by deed poll, misspell it. That means it's guaranteed that if they do try and prosecute you, the name's going to be wrong because it's spelled wrong. So things like that. So I would pick up loads of this sort of shit and I put them in the fanzine. I write articles. I wrote an article on the link between anarchism and pacifism, which was a little bit grandiose. I'm like, what, 15? What the flying fuck do I know about anything? But my attitude was, that's the whole point of this anarchist thing. It's never wrong. You're never wrong. You can't be wrong, because if you're wrong, that's adhering to a rule, and the rule has been broken. So I wrote a piece on Let's Talk About Anarchism, and immediately opening line, it's impossible to actually classify yourself as an anarchist unless you're a pacifist as well. That was it. I had no idea what the rest of the shite was, but anyway.
But it's funny who gets touched by these small outputs. You know, you're doing limited runs, but they get into the hands of people and they affect them very deeply. And you know, I'm very conscious today to remember people who aren't with us anymore. You know, Dave Maloney from the Vipers, Philip Chevron from the Radiators, and Jared McCaughton. You told me a great story once about your maths teacher during an exam, pacing up and down the room, and he stopped. Maybe it's because he knew you were an anarchist or a brilliant mathematician, but do you remember that story?
Yeah, I'm not sure what version of the story I told you, but the basics was I was doing a maths exam, and the maths teacher was walking up and down the aisles, and I always scribble things all over my books, as we all did, you know, my school bag and whatever else, and I had my book face down, and on the book it had, I think, Fight War Not Wars, and a drawn Crass logo or something like that. Anyway, and he walked past me and he stopped and he went, Crass, very impressive. And I spoke to him afterwards, and it's actually Mick McConnell's big brother. It was his big brother. And at one stage he said to me, we were talking about music, and he said he was a what do they call them, a boarding master. You know, in the school there was some people were boarders and some of them were day boarders, and he was one of the teachers who lived in the school. And he said, you must come up and have a look at some of my records. Now, you know, nowadays you go, I don't fucking think so, pal.
Different era.
But a different era, and he was a completely genuinely and a really, really nice bloke, and he looked much older than he was because he had a mustache. Mustache, old. No mustache, not old. And so I went up and looked through his record collection, and it was fucking phenomenal. It was phenomenal. A Honeybane record. I said, I'd never even seen this one. And then some weeks later, there was a great branch of Golden Discs on Liffey Street. Didn't one of Micro Disney work in there?
Yeah, Kissed Air working there.
Yeah, one of Kissed Air. Anyway, I was in there looking through the records, and I hear this. I pulled out a Discharge album that I had. I was looking at this, and I hear this voice behind me. Peter, if you like Discharge, you should probably enjoy Disorder. My little brother tells me it's very impressive. And it was Jerry McCon again. I said, really? Down the discharge, out with this order, and went and bought it. And he was right, it's absolutely fucking brilliant.
Yeah, never wrong, much missed. If you know me, you knew that the timing would go spectacularly wrong, so it is spectacularly wrong. If you have made reservations in restaurants, buy sandwiches next time. So we will have a very, very quick turnover. Thank you so much to the PA and the Bitsy.